At 1:58 a.m. on October 26, 1942, in the dark waters north of Guadalcanal, a damaged U.S. Navy destroyer broke radio silence and reported that it was still maneuvering under its own power. That report should not have been possible. The destroyer had taken multiple hits from Japanese naval gunfire during a night surface engagement. One boiler room was flooded. Electrical power was intermittent. Fire control circuits were damaged. Several compartments were burning or filled with smoke. Casualties had already exceeded what damage control doctrine considered survivable for a ship of that class. According to U.S. Navy expectations at the time, a destroyer suffering simultaneous flooding, fire, and loss of centralized control during a night action in restricted waters was expected to be abandoned or sunk within minutes. The waters around Guadalcanal were narrow, poorly charted, and contested by enemy forces skilled in night fighting. A disabled ship was not a candidate for recovery. It was a liability. Yet the destroyer did not stop. Instead, it altered course, increased speed beyond what its remaining machinery should have supported, and withdrew from the engagement without collision, grounding, or further damage. Hours later, it reached a temporary anchorage under its own power, with most of its crew still aboard. In the official action report, the ship's survival is described in restrained language. Damage is listed. Casualties are counted. Maneuvers are summarized. There is no explanation for how the ship maintained propulsion, steering, and internal control long enough to escape an engagement that had already destroyed other vessels in the same waters. From a distance, the outcome appears improbable. From the bridge and below decks, it was the result of a series of decisions made after the system designed to protect the ship had already failed. This is not a story about a decisive victory or a celebrated engagement. It is a story about a ship that remained functional after its design assumptions collapsed, and about how survival at sea became a technical problem long before it became a matter of courage. The waters around Guadalcanal in late 1942 formed one of the most dangerous naval environments of the Pacific War. Narrow channels, unpredictable currents, and limited visibility created ideal conditions for night surface combat. Both sides relied heavily on destroyers and light cruisers to contest control of these waters after dark. Night engagements favored forces that could maneuver quickly, identify targets with minimal light, and coordinate fire without revealing position. Japanese naval units had refined these techniques extensively before the war. American forces were still adapting. Visibility was poor even by night action standards. Cloud cover eliminated moonlight. Smoke from earlier engagements lingered low over the water. The coastline of Guadalcanal offered few clear reference points, increasing the risk of collision or grounding during evasive maneuvers. Sea conditions were moderate but deceptive. Swells were low enough to allow high speed, but strong enough to complicate damage control below decks. Flooding did not remain localized. Water moved unpredictably through compartments as the ship maneuvered. The destroyer operated as part of a screening force tasked with intercepting Japanese ships attempting to reinforce their positions on the island. The engagement unfolded rapidly. Radar contacts were intermittent. Visual identification occurred at close range. Gunfire was exchanged at distances that allowed little time for correction. When the destroyer was hit, it was operating near the edge of navigable water. Turning too sharply risked grounding. Slowing risked further hits. Maintaining speed increased internal stress on already damaged systems. Damage control doctrine assumed that flooding and fire could be isolated quickly, power rerouted, and command centralized. In this engagement, those assumptions failed almost immediately. Multiple compartments were affected at once. Communication between stations was disrupted. Control devolved to local decisions. the tactical environment offered no pause. Enemy ships remained nearby. Maneuvering room was limited. Every decision had to be made under pressure, with incomplete information, and with the understanding that delay could be fatal. The destroyer's commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander James A. Holt, 34 years old, a career naval officer who had spent most of his service in engineering billets before taking command. He was not known as a tactician. He was known for understanding machinery and for trusting the judgment of experienced petty officers. Before the war, Holt had served aboard ships where maintenance was prioritized over appearance. He believed that systems failed gradually, not suddenly, and that crews who understood those systems could keep them functioning beyond expected limits. The ship's engineering officer, Lieutenant Robert Gaines, came from a civilian background in mechanical systems. He had worked in power plants before entering the Navy. He understood steam, pressure, and the consequences of imbalance. Under normal conditions, he enforced procedures strictly. Under abnormal conditions, he adapted them cautiously. Below decks, damage control parties were led by chief petty officers with years of practical experience. Many had learned their trade in peacetime, responding to fires and flooding caused by accidents rather than combat. Their training emphasized containment, improvisation, and prioritization. None of these men expected to manage simultaneous flooding, fire, and maneuvering at high speed in restricted waters. Their training prepared them to respond to one crisis at a time. The situation they faced demanded decisions that crossed traditional boundaries between departments. When the first hits landed, command did not fragment because of discipline or heroics. It fragmented because centralized control became physically impossible. What replaced it was a network of local decisions guided by experience rather than doctrine. The men involved did not think in terms of saving the ship as an abstract goal. They thought in terms of keeping boilers lit, valves closed, fires contained, and rudder response intact for the next few minutes. Survival was measured in intervals short enough to manage. Those habits, formed long before combat, would determine whether the destroyer remained a ship or became wreckage in the dark waters off Guadalcanal. U.S. Navy destroyer doctrine in 1942 was built around centralized control. Combat information flowed to the bridge. Fire control solutions were calculated electrically and distributed mechanically. Engineering plants responded to orders passed down through established channels. Damage control operated according to predefined priorities, isolating compartments and restoring systems in sequence. The system assumed time. It assumed that hits would be limited, that flooding could be contained before spreading, and that electrical power could be rerouted faster than it was lost. It assumed that command decisions would be made from the bridge with a complete picture of the ship's condition. It assumed that individual departments would remain connected long enough for coordination to matter. During night surface actions near Guadalcanal, those assumptions were fragile, even before contact. Radar performance was inconsistent. Visual identification occurred at short range. Engagements escalated quickly, often faster than reporting cycles could keep up. When the destroyer was hit, multiple assumptions failed at once. Shell impacts ruptured piping and electrical conduits in different parts of the ship almost simultaneously. One boiler room began flooding while another lost power intermittently. Fire control circuits dropped offline, leaving gun crews without centralized direction. Smoke filled passageways, cutting off voice communication between stations. The system did not collapse cleanly. It fragmented. The bridge retained steering control but lost reliable information from below. Engineering spaces could maintain steam pressure, but only by improvising around damaged gauges and valves. Damage control parties operated without confirmation that their actions aligned with broader priorities. Doctrine provided no guidance for this state. Manuals addressed fires, flooding, and loss of power as separate problems. They did not account for all three occurring at once while the ship was maneuvering at speed in confined waters under threat of further attack. The destroyer was still afloat. It was still moving. But the system designed to keep it fighting as a coordinated whole no longer existed. What remained was a collection of functioning subsystems, each operating at the edge of its tolerance. Whether those subsystems could be held together long enough to escape depended on decisions made without centralized oversight, based on local conditions rather than global intent. The critical decision occurred minutes after the initial hits, when it became clear that remaining in the engagement would invite destruction. Lieutenant Commander Holt had incomplete information. Reports from below were delayed or contradictory. He knew there was flooding. He knew there were fires. He knew propulsion was uneven. He did not know how long any of those conditions could be managed. He faced two options. The first was to continue engaging. Remaining in formation would preserve mutual support and maintain pressure on enemy ships. It would also require maintaining speed and maneuverability that the destroyer could no longer guarantee. Further hits would likely be catastrophic. The second option was withdrawal. Breaking contact would expose the ship during the turn, risk collision in restricted waters, and potentially leave it isolated if propulsion failed completely. Doctrine allowed withdrawal for damaged ships, but executing it under these conditions carried significant risk. Holt chose to withdraw. The decision was not dramatic. It was procedural. The ship's purpose had shifted from contributing firepower to preserving itself and its crew. Remaining engaged no longer served a meaningful tactical function. Once the order was given, there was no margin for hesitation. Turning too slowly risked further hits. Turning too sharply risked grounding. Speed had to be increased, even as machinery was failing. The destroyer began its withdrawal under conditions that offered no rehearsal and no correction. The decision committed the ship to a narrow window in which everything that still worked had to continue working just a little longer. Survival during withdrawal depended on maintaining just enough propulsion, steering, and internal control to outrun immediate threats without tearing the ship apart. In engineering spaces, crews isolated flooding by improvising barriers from available materials. Watertight doors that could not be fully closed were reinforced manually. Pumps were rerouted to compartments not designed for dewatering. Steam pressure was balanced unevenly, favoring engines that still responded reliably. Electrical power was restored locally where possible. Portable lighting replaced failed circuits. Sound-powered phones became the primary means of communication when electrical systems failed. Orders were passed slowly, deliberately, and often redundantly to ensure they were understood. On the bridge, Holt maintained a steady course rather than aggressive, evasive maneuvers. Predictability reduced internal stress and minimized the risk of collision in low visibility. Speed was increased gradually to avoid shock loads on damaged machinery. Gun crews operated independently. Without centralized fire control, they engaged only when targets presented clear opportunity. Firing was restrained to avoid revealing position and to conserve power and ammunition. Damage control teams prioritized containment over restoration. Fires were allowed to burn in controlled spaces rather than being extinguished immediately, if doing so risked spreading smoke or compromising structural integrity. Flooded compartments were abandoned when containment could not be guaranteed. Every decision was a compromise. Reducing speed eased mechanical stress but increased exposure. Increasing speed preserved distance but risked machinery failure. Fighting fires aggressively reduced heat but increased oxygen flow. Each choice traded one danger for another. The ship's survival was not the result of a single action. It was the accumulation of dozens of small decisions that kept critical systems functioning just long enough. When the destroyer finally cleared immediate threat and reached safer waters, it did so not because it had recovered, but because it had not yet failed completely. The difference was measured in minutes. The cost of the withdrawal became clear once the destroyer reached temporary anchorage. What had been managed under motion now revealed its full extent once the ship slowed, and systems were assessed without the pressure of immediate pursuit. Flooded compartments remained partially submerged. Makeshift barriers held, but only barely. Pumps that had been pushed beyond design limits showed signs of imminent failure. Steam lines leaked at joints that had been stressed unevenly during the run at speed. Electrical circuits restored locally could not be synchronized into a stable grid. Casualties were higher than initial estimates suggested. Smoke inhalation affected men who had remained at their stations far longer than recommended. Burns were treated with limited supplies. Shrapnel wounds that had seemed superficial under adrenaline worsened once swelling set in. Fatigue was pervasive and profound. The crew's physical condition reflected cumulative strain rather than a single moment of trauma. Hands shook from exertion. Voices were hoarse from shouting through smoke-filled passageways. Several men collapsed once the immediate tasking ended, not from injury, but from exhaustion, reaching a point where we could no longer compensate. The ship itself was no longer combat capable. Gun systems required recalibration. Engineering spaces needed overhaul. Damage control boundaries that had held during movement were not sustainable at rest. The destroyer would require days of repair before any consideration of rejoining operations. There was no celebration. The survival of the ship was acknowledged quietly, as a matter of accounting rather than triumph. Logs were updated. Damage reports were compiled. The focus shifted immediately to restoration and redistribution of forces still able to fight. What had been gained was survival. What had been lost was capacity. The destroyer had escaped, but it had done so by expending nearly all remaining margin. In the days that followed, the action was absorbed into the larger operational picture around Guadalcanal. Engagements continued. Ships were lost and replaced. The destroyer's survival was noted, but not emphasized. Official reports documented damage, repair timelines, and personnel status. Tactical analysis focused on engagement outcomes rather than individual withdrawals. The system evaluated performance at scale, not at the level of a single ship's endurance under failure. No immediate doctrinal changes followed. Night surface actions remained hazardous. Damage control manuals were not rewritten. The assumptions underpinning centralized control persisted because they remained broadly effective under most conditions. Informally, however, experience traveled differently. Engineering officers discussed improvisations that had worked. Damage control teams shared techniques for isolating flooding without full closure. Commanders noted the limits of centralized decision-making when systems fragmented too quickly to sustain it. The destroyer returned to service weeks later in a reduced role. Its crew changed. Some men were reassigned. Others carried injuries that ended their sea duty entirely. The ship itself was altered by repairs that reflected lessons learned quietly rather than codified formally. The event did not change the war. It did not alter strategy, but it contributed to a growing body of experience that shaped how individuals understood the gap between doctrine and reality. The waters north of Guadalcanal are calmer now. Shipping passes through routes once contested at night by ships operating on instinct as much as instruction. The destroyer's name appears in naval records, its engagement summarized in a few restrained lines that describe damage sustained and actions taken. What those lines cannot convey is how survival unfolded after the system designed to protect the ship had fractured, how it depended on local judgment, restraint, and the willingness to accept imperfect solutions when perfect ones were no longer available. The ship survived not because it met expectations, but because its crew understood which expectations no longer applied and adjusted accordingly until safer water replaced immediate threat. If you value carefully researched stories like this, grounded in real events, and focused on how survival actually unfolded, consider subscribing to the channel to support our team and help us continue preserving these histories.